Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I am the host of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. This is episode 8, and here we're going to talk about why we fight. Now, I'm not talking about me and you here in the backyard, like neighbors, rolling around on the ground. No, I'm talking about why we as Americans, as a country, engage in all these wars all around the world, different types of conflicts, surrogate wars of all types. Why do we always find ourselves fighting? And so the context of this discussion is going to be totally in a modern context because the point is to explain how this secret, I don't know how to call it, secret drain, secret impact on our lives have accumulated over these years to actually be a determinative factor for why everything seems so much worse off today in America than it used to be. Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the story that I'm going to tell starts with World War II. Now, this is the most covered war in our lives. There's not a person watching this podcast who hasn't seen a movie, taken a test, studied it in school, what have you, on World War II. So I'm not going to get into the minutia of the war. I'm just going to cover the top layers and extract the things that are really important that kind of build into where we are today in America. Okay. So World War II started in September of 1939 when Germany, Nazi Germany, attacked Poland. And this was Hitler's start of Hitler's effort to dominate Europe, to dominate maybe the world. We never did get to find out what his ultimate goal is, thankfully. And so he attacks Poland in September 1939. And immediately, France and the United Kingdom wage war on Germany. So now there's a two-front war. And by June of 1940, Germany defeats France. And by defeating France, I mean the British forces in mainland Europe fighting with the French and the French forces defending their homeland in France. And so the French surrender by June of 1940. The French surrender. And the British forces who didn't die in the combat, and a large contingency of them, escaped via Dunkirk back to the UK. I think historians will say this was one of the most impactful mistakes that Hitler made, that he got distracted and somehow did not capture those British forces before they got back to the UK. Okay, so by June 1940, France had surrendered. Okay, the next major thing happens. What is it about June? In June 1942, Germany attacks the Soviet Union. Okay, here we go. All right, so June 1941, Germany attacks the Soviet Union. So now we have the establishment of a genuine two-front war. Right? Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. The Southern/Western Front will be, right now, it's Great Britain, but they have retreated back to the island of Great Britain. Okay, so this is where the war is. The next major thing that happens is, what can I say? Japan attacks the United States at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So now officially, the United States has joined the war as we move into 1942. And the rest of the war in Europe is going to occur for the next 3 years and will end when Germany ultimately surrenders in May of 1945. So, but the next major event that happens in between those few years from the time that the United States entered when Japan attacked us on December 7th, 1941, to the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, right? The most significant event besides the actual combat, ironically, was the 1944 Democratic Convention in July 1944. Go figure. But here's the story. So FDR is going for his fourth term as president of the United States, unprecedented. And his popularity is unmatched, but his health is not good. So they're trying to squeeze one more out of him. And his vice president that he selected, because he knew his health wasn't well. So for his third term, he selected a young, vigorous, liberal New Deal politician named Henry Wallace, who was his vice president. And Henry Wallace was no joke. Now, up to this point in U.S. history, the vice president was purely ceremonial. But Henry Wallace carried a lot of weight, and he became an extremely important vice president. And within his portfolio, he actually managed how we prioritize resources back in the States to support the war effort. He managed two of the major intergovernmental agencies which provided the material for the war effort, right? So very important. But he was a liberal, and he had a very progressive idea of what the world would look like after World War II, after this was over. Because remember, coming into World War II, we in the United States are coming out of the Great Depression. The whole reason why Roosevelt got these 4 terms was because he had shifted us out of this laissez-faire free market capitalism system that was only benefiting the wealthiest amongst us at the expense of everyone else. So he was elected to save capitalism by creating the New Deal, a new commitment to build the working class and the middle class of America. And that process had started in the 1930s, and then we all got distracted by World War II. So Henry Wallace was going to continue that theme. And one of his most famous speeches spoke about his projection of the future. And the speech was the century for the common man. And Henry Wallace's vision, in a nutshell, right, was a New Deal, a global New Deal. So just imagine, everywhere in the world, working class and middle class people, governments committed, economics committed to invest in them, to allow their full participation, their full empowerment, so that they could participate in economics and politics. You know, that was his global vision. But it was a threat to the conservatives in the Democratic Party, because the conservatives, first and foremost, were industrialists, capitalists, extreme wealth, right? Okay. Because Roosevelt was wealthy, right? And they were fearful of communism. And here was Henry Wallace talking about, no. After this is all over, we are going to extend the New Deal globally. And we're going to advocate for policies around the world, in South America, in Central America, in Asia, in the Soviet Union, with our enemies and with our friends, for a new global New Deal. That was Henry Wallace's vision. And oh no, the industrialists could not have that. Extreme wealth was certainly not going to have that, because, oh, by the way, they were frightened of communism. So at the Democratic Convention in 1944, right, well, first and foremost, what they did was they just put enormous pressure on Franklin Roosevelt that coming into his 4th term, he needs to pick someone else. And Roosevelt understood. Wallace was the person he wanted to continue his vision for the post-war world, which did match what Wallace was intending to do. Global New Deal, the century for the common man. Okay. So FDR refused to simply outright abandon his vice president, even though so many of the power brokers in his party and his class were pushing vigorously to get rid of him. So all he was willing to do is say, that going into the convention, that if Wallace if Wallace came up for a vote, he would support Wallace, Henry Wallace, his man. But if the convention chose someone else, he would yield to the will of the convention. And that's where Roosevelt left it. So coming into but leading up to that, these power brokers in the year leading up to the convention were able to get Wallace squeezed out of these powerful positions where he was running these massive committees that were controlling priorities, allocation of resources that were supporting the war effort because they were too powerful for him, and they're trying to get him out of power, right? So 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 what FDR did is okay, send him on a world tour, 1943, 1944, around the world, talking about this global New Deal. And it made, to the chagrin of these power brokers, it made Henry Wallace extremely popular. Extremely popular. He was the heir apparent, right? And so back to the July 1944, time for these power brokers to get Wallace out, right? And so they come up and they show up, and the convention is essentially overrun because Henry Wallace is so popular that all these convention goers, legitimate, and maybe this sounds familiar, like kind of like Bernie Sanders, right? The energy of the party was supporting Henry Wallace for vice president. They already had concluded the nomination, of course, of FDR, who was the heir apparent, but most everyone thought it was likely he wouldn't survive. So this vice presidential nominee was going to be huge. They would be the next president of the United States. Okay. So the convention is booming. Music is playing. Fans are going crazy. The audience is dominated by Henry Wallace supporters, right? So the first of Democratic shenanigans is, oh no, if they brought it to a vote tonight, he would just blow out and get the nomination. Can't have that. So they finagled, some character, I don't even know where he was from, put in a motion to adjourn the first night without bringing it to a vote. And that's what they did. And overnight, this is when arms were twisted, necks were twisted. Everything was twisted. Oops. But now, night two, they bring it to a vote. And despite all the arm twisted, Henry Wallace he doesn't get enough for the nomination, but he's way out ahead of the next person, which is Harry Truman, right? Their hand-picked guy who they knew had a different vision of what the post-war world would be like. Yeah. Not favorable to the communists, not favorable to the Soviet Union by any stretch. Okay. But Henry Wallace was in the lead. And then they proceeded tightening the screws, doing all the deals, back rooms, this and that and other. And on the second vote, in a landslide, this person who no one knew outside of that convention hall, and his hometown, Truman won the nomination to be the vice president of the United States. Okay, so so the power brokers got their way. And I just want you to know, before we get into it, this shenanigans changed the course of world history. Full stop. Okay. So now it is from the time that the United States ended this war in December 7th, 1941. The war in Europe is going on. The bloodiest war in global history. Just the magnitude of deaths across Europe. Okay. Mostly on the Eastern Front, and we'll get to that. Okay. So now, finally, it's breaking the back of the German military. Finally, it's winding down in 1945. So now discussions are occurring because the war is going on in the Pacific, and it's bloody and it's brutal, and China is in it on our side and losing just an enormous amount of people. We'll get to those numbers in a second. Okay. So they have the Yalta Conference. Okay. Yalta Conference. in February 4th, 1945, where FDR, still kicking it, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union. Okay, they get together and they say, okay, we got to have a strategy for what we're going to do in ending the war in Europe, because the Germans are very close to surrendering, and then transitioning to the Pacific to get the Japanese to surrender soon. Okay. And the agreement they make, and it's been brewing for a while. It's been brewing from the fall of 1944. FDR has asked, and Stalin has agreed, that as soon as Germany surrenders, the Red Army will join the United States in the Pacific, wage war against Japan, and do in Europe, do in the Pacific, do in Japan and in Asia what they did in Europe. And let me be clear, what they did in Europe is take the lion's share of the physical losses. The numbers will speak, and we'll get to that in a second. And Stalin agreed to do it. He needed reinforcements because there was issues in terms of getting the military equipment, through the Soviet Union, through the normal passes. So they needed America's help doing it by sea and other forms. FDR said, let's do it. Okay, so they had the Yalta Agreement. And so Stalin said, 3 months, I need 3 months. And we will, 3 months from the time that Germany surrenders, we will go ahead and we will declare war, and we will join the fight in the Pacific. Okay. That's February 1945. April 12th, 1945, FDR dies. They knew it was possible. They didn't know when. Here it is. But all that shenanigans at the Democratic Convention in 1944 is about to pay off, because Harry Truman becomes the president of the United States instead of Henry Wallace. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, May, 1 month later, May 1945, Germany surrenders. Beautiful. Beautiful. We got a game plan. Germany surrendered. 3 months later, June, July, August, right? Okay. So May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. So by August 8th, 1945, Russia, the Soviet Union, is joining the combat mission in the Pacific against the Japanese. Why? Because it's now legendary what the Soviet Union did to Germany and Europe. Everybody knows what the Soviet Union did to Germany and Europe. And so when Japan sees them coming, willing to do the same thing to them, right? Okay. It changes the dynamic. Okay. The point was to get Japan to surrender with as few deaths as possible. But Harry Truman had a different idea. Because again, he was no friend of the Soviet Union. The people who selected him are no friends of the Soviet Union, because they are wealthy industrialists who view communism as a threat to capitalism. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so just as the Soviet Union is about to declare war against Japan, President Truman orders American forces to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, August 6th and August 9th of 1945. On August 8th, like on cue, with everyone knowing this because they planned this for over a year and agreed to it at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union joined the war in the Pacific and declared war on Japan. Okay. Now here is where the change in history comes. Because it absolutely, most credible historians recognize that it was not necessary to drop the atomic bombs on Japan on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, because the Soviet Union was joining. Now, to underline the significance of the Soviet Union joining the war in the Pacific, and to undermine the ridiculous narrative that we have been told in history class and on TV and in movies and stuff like that as to why we had to drop the bomb, right? Let us go over the casualty count for the war in Europe, okay? So, okay, the casualties. Now, I got to pull all, okay, so good. Okay. And I'm just going to talk about on the Allied side, okay? So, as we went over, France surrendered in June of 1940. They lost 600,000 people, 210,000 soldiers, and the rest were civilians in the combat before they surrendered. Okay. The UK lost 451,000, of which 384,000 were military. The UK. Okay. The United States lost 262,000, right? Almost all military in Europe, right? Though we did lose 407,000 soldiers totally, but that includes the Pacific. But in Europe, 262. Okay. So that is 600,000 for France in defeat, 451,000 for the UK, 262,000 for us. The Soviet Union on the Eastern Front lost, and this is the low end. This is the lowest end of a number that historians all validate. 20 million. Yeah, I didn't stutter. 20 million, including 8.7 million soldiers. That's what they lost on that side. And not because they didn't fight like hell. No, it's because 200 divisions of the Nazi military was catching hell on the Eastern Front. And they pushed the Soviet Union deep into Russia, destroying, razing, blazing, tearing up, killing, slaughtering everything in their wake deep into Russia. But it's a big place, 11 timelines. I'm just saying, it's a huge place. Yeah. In 1963, in President Kennedy's famous speech on peace, he speaks at the magnitude of the sacrifice and the magnitude of the destruction that Nazi Germany imposed on the Soviet Union. But the problem is they would not give up. They didn't. So when the Japanese, seeing what had happened in Europe, 20 million, 8.7 million Red Army soldiers, and still fighting. Yes. It was the Soviets who freed Auschwitz and all those concentration camps in the East as they broke the back of the Nazi military. Yes. So for all our courageous fighting in the Southern and Western fronts, and it was courageous. And that's all we hear about. Let me just put it into some historical perspective. That 10 times the fighting was going on the Eastern Front. Okay? That's give you some order of magnitude that we're talking about. And so so this was what the Soviet Union was bringing to bear. This is what both Churchill knew damn well and FDR knew, which is why, despite them being communists, they were the essential ally. Let's not get it twisted. They were the essential ally. In other words, you ask your chat GPT, based on all available data from World War II, had the Soviet Union surrendered after 5 million deaths. And again, the historians are between 20 million and 27 million. So we're just saying, let's just stay with the lowest number, 20 million. If they had surrendered after the first 5 million, I mean, damn, who could have blamed them? Almost 10 times the losses as France, when France surrendered, okay? And I'm not blaming the French, but so no one would have blamed the Soviet Union for surrendering after the first 5 million deaths, right? But that, based on the timeline, It was only 4 years from the time that that Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and surrendered in May of 1945. So 5 million puts you at like June of 1942. Okay? So if the 200 divisions got to shift to the United States forces and the British forces because the France had already was surrendered in 1940, how many more of us would die? How many of us in this podcast conversation would not be alive because our parents would have been killed in World War II? Okay, this is to give you some magnitude of the sacrifice and the essential nature of the Soviet Union fighting the way they did in World War II and allowing themselves, fighting despite the 8.7 million soldiers, 20 million people died at the hands of the Germans. So yeah, let's be clear. Japan was the argument that we were given why it was essential for us to drop these bombs on Japan. Because first and foremost, we wanted absolute surrender. And the Japanese were worried that absolute surrender would mean that we would execute their empire, the emperor. And they were going to die for their emperor. They were not going to let you execute the emperor. So they wanted a condition. They wanted to protect the emperor. So they had conditions. We didn't want to give them conditions. We wanted absolute. They attacked us. They going down. Period. Don't blame us. Don't blame us. Okay. But the idea was, the excuse that was given, the narrative that we all know is that we dropped those bombs because it saved more American lives to do so. If we didn't drop the bombs, the argument would have been that tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 or more Americans would have died in combat trying to defeat Japan on their home turf, right? But as I told you, the Red Army, the new sheriff was in town, and they were going to do what they did in Europe. The waves were coming, and they weren't going to stop fighting until what happened to Germany happened to Japan. Japan knew that they were going to be fighting to the last person, but the Soviet Union was not going to give up. So they would have surrendered. That's why most credible historians said they would have surrendered. So it was a complete fabrication. But the reason why we did it, because we were already planting the seeds for the post-war world where we got a new enemy, and it's the Soviet Union. And this is where I'm going to say straight up, the greatest betrayal in world history at the national level was making the Soviet Union America's enemy at the end of World War II. There's not a credible rationale to support it. So let's talk about the threat of communism versus capitalism. Okay? There's no question the communist system is a different type of politics, and socialism is a different type of economics. Public ownership versus private ownership. Yes, these are different systems. This is true. Different systems. But we happen to be constituted on the principle of freedom, right? Which means that the people, government of the people, for the people, by the people, right, should be able to decide what is the best system of economics that works for all of us. And if capitalism is the best system of economics, so be it. Great. But God forbid, if it is socialism, if public ownership works better, then the people are free to make that choice too, right? Isn't that our system of government? But oh no, that decision was being made for us by power. And the first way they did it was to push Henry Wallace out of the vice presidency to have Harry Truman in place to make sure that we would betray the greatest ally America ever had. Let's be serious. That is the truth. And we did, right? So what did we do? Japan surrenders in September 1945. Yeah. As the combat with the Red Army had begun over the course of that month of August. Oh, they were coming. They were coming, right? So Japan, that date's done. We had enough of that. Right. They didn't even demand we protect the emperor. They wanted us to protect the emperor, and we didn't execute him. I'm just saying. We just wanted the right to do it. Oh, we had 400,000 American deaths. We wanted some payback. Okay. But we didn't execute the emperor. Okay. But that said, end of the war. Okay. Post-war, Henry Wallace once, the century of the common man, global New Deal, friends and enemies, economics serving the middle class, the working class, the broad populations, so that we all can participate both in our government and in our economics. We could all live a good life. Wouldn't that have been nice? Oh, no, hell no. We're not doing that. Immediately, by the end of World War II, now Germany had surrendered. The Soviet Union did their duty. They came to the Pacific, forced Japan to, don't get it twisted about the 2 atom bombs. Okay? Right, right, right. It was Russia, so the Red Army coming to do what they did in Europe. That was the death knell of Japan. It was over, right? Because no one had done what the Soviet Union had done in Europe. Okay. So what did we do to make sure we poison the well? To make sure that the Cold War is going to be deeply etched. Okay. So the Soviet Union, their concern was we are done with these European wars. Okay. 3 times European powers had attacked Russia. In the Napoleonic Wars, this was the death knell of Napoleon. And you talk about history repeating itself. Unfortunately, for the Europeans, when they attacked Russia in World War One, right? They caught Russia at their weakest moment, probably in hundreds of years. Why? Because the Tsar was on the outs about to collapse to the Russian Revolution, which was happening right there around the same time that World War One occurred. And so, yes, that weakened transitional state of Russia did lose. And I mean, they surrendered. It took them less than a year, but it was near the end of the war. But that's the scenario that was going on there. There was cross currents internally, along with this war happening from the external side. Okay. And I think maybe that gave Hitler, so forget about what happened to Napoleon. That's the French. We tore them up in 1940, so we're good. That gave him the thinking, because it took him another year to attack the Soviet Union. I'd say, hey, they didn't put up much of a fight in 1917, right? And we're much stronger than we were then. So this is not going to be a problem. I think that's probably what happened. I don't know. But he certainly found out that he was in a fight, and these people were not going to quit. So okay. So now that all this is done, we decide. They say to us, okay, we want a security buffer, an established security buffer, because all the conflicts between Russia and Europe always start. I said always, yes, in the last 300 years, always start with a European power attacking Russia. Check it out, right? I'm not saying that Russia has not had historical skirmishes with their neighbors, Finland, whoever's next door. Yeah, that's normal. Alsace-Lorraine, Germany and France. How many times has gone back and forth? Come on. It is normal for border countries to have little skirmishes. But we're talking about major incursion where Russia is going to attack Great Britain, where Russia is going to attack France, where Russia is going to attack Germany. No, that doesn't happen. But those countries come to attack Russia, go all the way across Europe to attack Russia. to the tune of millions of deaths. 20 million this time. So when the Soviet Union said, after what we did, after the sacrifice we got, I mean, all of you, look at all of you, you have less. We lost more soldiers than all the civilians you lost, than all the soldiers you lost combined. When we say we want a security buffer because the threat is coming from Europe, I think they had something to say. I think they had a point, right? But since we were so damn interested in making an enemy out of the country who may have saved us, they said, okay, fine. Obviously, we're not working together. Obviously, what we did together in defeating a country that was intended on defeating all of us, right, wasn't good enough to earn your friendship because we have a different system of economics, because we have a different system of government. Oh, we're not self-determined like you are. We can't do this. This is why it has to be enemies. Okay, so, there it is. So then we are going to hold on to these areas. We're going to seize control. We're taking half. We're taking a half. We're taking a good portion of Germany. Yeah, because they started this. We're going to take control over Eastern Europe. We're going to take control now that Japan is defeated, and Japan had control over Korea. We're going to take control of North Korea. Yeah, how about that? Since it's going to be like this. And you know what we did? Oh yeah, you go ahead with your bad self. And I know I'm being funny, but no, this is what we did. We instituted the Marshall Plan and had the temerity to rebuild Germany and Japan. I mean, can you imagine for a moment, please imagine for a moment, how we would feel as Americans if 20 million Americans died in a war against an enemy where our allies, after the war was over, made us their enemy? Just could you wrap your brain around the magnitude of betrayal that we would feel as Americans? Because this is what we did to them. And we compounded it by not only rebuilding the country who killed 20 million Soviets, right? Marshall Plan. Okay. But then we proceeded to purge the American people, McCarthyism, to purge the American people of any pre-World War II association with communism, with socialism, with the Soviet Union. Yeah. Just think about that. We're supposed to be the free society. They're supposed to be the totalitarians. Who should decide in America whether we want a capitalist free market economy or a socialist centrally controlled economy? Who should decide that? I would think under our system of government, it would be the American people. But instead, what we did is we destroyed the American people who felt that way. We destroyed anyone who had a pre-war association. It was everybody. Even the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, who developed the atom bomb that we use, quote unquote, to end the war, right? Oppenheimer stripped him of his secret clearances because he had a pre-war association in the 1930s, 1920s. Not even a deep association, just a tangential. Had a card from somewhere, might have attended a meeting years ago, right? We strip one of the key contributors to the war effort of this and destroy their reputation and say that they cannot work in government anymore. Thank you very kindly for your service. Yeah, that's how much we vilified and purged America of communism, socialism, and anyone who had any affiliation with the Soviet Union. So this is the magnitude of hatred we bestowed on the Soviet Union. The first post-war conflict after World War II, after the Marshall Plan, us rebuilding Europe and Germany and Japan, you know, was the Korean War. And again, the reason why the Korean War became a conflict was that as Japan relinquished, because they surrendered control of Korea, the Soviet Union was establishing security buffers. And it would have been friendly if they remained an ally, as they were during the war, but it wasn't friendly because we decided to make an enemy out of them. So they claimed North Korea above the 38th parallel, and we claimed South Korea. And then you had a war between U.S. trained forces and U.S. forces from the South, and Soviet forces to the North. And it didn't last long, a couple of years in the early 1950s. And we had an armistice, some technical word for, okay, we're going to have a ceasefire. And literally there was never an official end to the war. And the creation of a demilitarization zone in between. And North Korea really became a satellite, first of the Soviet Union and then ultimately of China. And now they're independent and they're allies now, but that's the history there. So that was the first skirmish, establishing our enemy as the Soviet Union and communism. Okay. So 2 terms of Eisenhower, 2 terms of it getting chilly and chillier between us and the Soviet Union, 2 terms of across the 50s of the Soviet Union establishing the Warsaw Pact, their hold on Eastern Europe, including East Germany, the creation of East Germany and several countries across Eastern Europe. Now, one of the things that are not told about how the Soviet Union took control over Eastern Europe, and by the way, they weren't nice. And why? Let this be understood. They weren't nice because, yeah, they probably were a little bitter over the fact that they were the reason why the Allied forces won World War II, right? But they were being vilified. So their control was about their security. It wasn't about the local people in Europe that happened to be the puppets, and that the Western European powers could care less about their well-being because instead of making peace with the ally that saved them, they decided to make the ally that saved them their enemy, and unfortunately, Eastern Europe got caught in the middle. That's what happened, okay? But what the Soviet Union said to these Eastern European powers is that, hey, if you swear neutrality, you're a free country. You're just not free to ally with people who are making us enemies. Now, if you agree to be free with the caveat that you're not going to make peace, you're not going to be allies with people who are intent to be our enemy. If you're willing to agree to that, then we will pull the Red Army out of your country, and you just continue to run the country with that one caveat. And guess what? Austria took them up on that in 1955. Check it out. And guess what the Soviet Union did? They removed the Red Army out of Austria, and Austria has been free ever since. Okay. The rest of these people, well, they made their choice. They got what they get. Because again, it wasn't the Soviet Union who created the Cold War. This was our choice. We did. We chose to rebuild Germany. We chose to purge America, punish, destroy American citizens for any pre-war association, pre-war association with communism, socialism, or the Soviet Union. I mean, if we had a shred of integrity, right? They were communists before the war. They were communists when they were taking all those deaths on our behalf, when they were taking the teeth of the combat, 200 divisions were fighting against them. They were communists doing that, right? I mean, they were communists when our president asked their president, their premier, to join us in the Pacific, and they did. Yeah, but that's okay. All that's forgotten because we got what we wanted. Germany was dead. Now we're just training them to be our puppy or whatever this is, right? And now we have a new enemy. This is how America rolls. This is how Great Britain rolls, right? Okay. So we get through the 50s and it's frosty. And President Eisenhower, gives the most amazing speech. I mean, I tell you, it on January 17th, 1961, President Eisenhower gives a speech. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Before I get to 1961 and Eisenhower's speech, another event in the 50s. So the Korean War is winding down, 52, whatever, armistice. And this is issue going on in Iran. What's going on is Iran used to be just part of the British Empire, right? And as it gained its independence, the dispute was over between the British Empire, Great Britain, and Iran was who has the rights to Iranian oil deposits, Iranian oil in Iranian territory as a sovereign country. And Great Britain felt, yeah, we, hey, we have invested money in this and we have a right to have that oil. And so there was treaties over how you split the oil proceeds, which of course the Iranians were going to get the short end of that stick. Okay. So, Iran is having enough of this. Now, according to the latest agreement, getting into like 1951, 52, okay, was that, okay, that even though Iran was going to get the short end of the stick, the British oil industry had to open up their books to show how much oil they were extracting, so to verify and to validate how much revenue would go to the Iranians and the Iranian people. Ain't that nice? This is the way they're going to find out how much of their own oil they get to benefit from. Okay, but that's the reality. And you wouldn't believe that the British did not want to open their books. You're going to take what I give you and you're going to like it. Right? So the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, supported by the Shah, his name was Mohammad Mossadegh. And he said, we've had enough of this. We're already getting the short end of the stick. You won't open the books to confirm that at least we're getting what we're supposed to get under the short end of the stick. So we're nationalizing the oil. Because guess what? It's Iranian oil. There's no question it's Iranian oil. We used to be a colony. We're not a colony. We have, as a sovereign country, we have a right to the resources in our country. Okay, so he nationalized it. And what did the British do? I see. Don't make me say bad things, but they just whined to Big Daddy, the United States, to say, "Oh, we can't have this. Look what they're doing. They're actually taking their own oil back. Please help us." And the CIA was more than happy to go ahead and have Mossadegh removed, and it empowered the Shah This time, you're going to put someone in there who's going to know how to act. And Shaw said, well, I got a few flunkies, but ultimately I'm the guy. And I know how to act. And you, the United States and Great Britain, we are besties. And we were from the mid 50s all the way up to 1978 ish, when the Shah was dying of cancer and was losing hold of power and needed some help getting out. Now, we'll pick up the story then. But so that we understand each other, in 1953, yeah, 1953, right, we overthrew, through CIA covert activities, verifiable, the democratically elected government, prime minister of Iran, because they had the temerity of nationalizing Iranian oil deposits that the British were screwing them in terms of the short end of the stick that they were supposed to get, would not open the books to verify that the short end of the stick was at least accurate. And when they nationalized, we overthrew their government. Want to know why Iran became our enemy? It starts here. Okay. So that was the last little tidbit of the 1950s that I wanted to get to before I get to Eisenhower's last farewell speech. The link to Eisenhower's speech, 16 minutes, is in the notes for episode 8, right below. You must. You owe it to yourself to see how a president can talk to the American people and not make you feel like a complete idiot. It doesn't talk to you like it's a bumper sticker, like he's a billboard, but talks to you like you're a grown person and you understand serious and sophisticated issues and complex stuff going on. What a speech he gave. This was his last speech before President Kennedy was going to take office. We sworn in. So this is January 17th, 1961. And in the speech, the takeaway that everyone knows about the speech, who knows of this speech, was that he warned us. He warned us about the dangers of the permanent military industrial complex. And in this speech, what he said is that, prior to World War II, we didn't have a permanent arms industry in the United States. That American manufacturing had the capability, when needed, to be converted from plowshares to swords, to be able to do military equipment. And that's what we did in World War II. But now that we made the Soviet Union, he didn't say that, but now that we have made the Soviet Union our enemy, we no longer have the ability to defer to the preparation for war, the ability to build military arms. We had to have a permanent industry, and we had a permanent industry. He built a permanent industry. Post World War II, we hardly downsized. And now you had a military industrial complex made of 3.5 million people full time, right? And he said, in 1961, we were spending more on our national defense than the pre-tax income of every company in the United States. Okay, so he said that great decisions require balance. So we must balance security with liberty. And that the warning was, in the interest of security, that the undue influence of the military industrial complex, we must be diligent in making sure that the influence of the military industrial complex is always equally balanced against the interests of freedom, of liberty. Okay. and that the undue balance, the undue influence of the military industrial complex, the threat that it would make to democracy, is it would change us. It would change us. It would change our politics. It would change our economics. It would change us spiritually. That's what he said. And he warned us about this. Okay. So that's 1941. And who's Eisenhower? Well, he was a five-star general who led U.S. armed forces during World War II. That's who he was. So no one knew the military like Eisenhower knew the military, right? And then he led 8 years in the White House, 1952 to 1960. Okay, so he knew what he was talking about, and he knew the industry that was growing, and it was already that big. Okay, that was his warning. Kennedy serves. We have the, again, we're still beating the drum against the Soviet Union, still provoking the conflict. When Eisenhower was warning about the undue influence of the military industrial complex, part of the application that we can all see that he was referring to, right, was what it did to the economics. You see, in the name of security, we will spend what we need to spend for security. And so, but the need for security intensifies if you have an enemy. And so this is where it destroys politics. This is where it destroys our spirit. We have an enemy because a country refuses to negotiate, refuses diplomacy, everything that you've tried to do, trade, to make things work, they refuse. And your last position is that we have to go to war because you're threatening. Now you're creating an actual threat to my security, the security of my country. So now we go to war. War is supposed to be the last stage where diplomacy has failed, and now we must fight because it's either me or you at this point. Okay. Well, if you mutate that into creating enemies, into encouraging people to be your enemies, into selecting who you choose to have as enemies so that you can have the fight, so that you can spend the money, so that you can make profit off war. Okay. This is where it affects the moral fiber of the nation. This is where it poisons the politics. And so when Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the armed forces, five-star general in World War II, war profiteering was treason. Yeah, you wouldn't believe that today, would you? Okay, okay. So here we are, right? Now we roll past into the Kennedy administration, and with the first major thing, we have, well, a couple of things. Out of the box, Eisenhower's people, ironically, convinced Kennedy to do what? To do this plan to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. Okay? Fails miserably. It wasn't Kennedy's plan. It was Eisenhower's folks, remnants. All this work had been done, but it hadn't been executed before Eisenhower left office. And so Kennedy got roped into it, and the momentum of the thing had taken off, and he said, fine, go ahead and do it. Absolute abject failure. Right. But it sent the signal to Castro that, oh, by the way, we're trying to overthrow you because you can't be communist. I'm sorry, right? Well, this is how we roll. Okay, so fine. Forget about the fact that Cuba is a sovereign country. You know, big United States frightened of Cuba. That we have to squash the ant. That's the attitude we took. Okay, so Bay of Pigs fail. The next thing, that's 61, 62, we catch the Soviet Union putting intercontinental nuclear missiles in Cuba. They deny it. They deny it. Bold-faced lying. They deny it. And we, in a brilliant moment, Adlai Stevens, brought out the evidence. Colin Powell, wherever you are, my brother, I wish you had an Adlai Stevenson moment. Unfortunately, your moment was the exact opposite. But Adlai Stevenson brought out the evidence so that the world could see that the Soviet Union had lost their mind because they were putting intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles that can hit hit every city but Seattle, and maybe Seattle too. In Cuba, 100 miles off the coast. So we can't have that. And we proceeded to blockades and, all this other stuff, all this international action, bringing the world to the brink of World War III. Okay. How did we solve that mission? How did we solve the crisis? Okay, so the official story was we said Khrushchev agreed that he would remove the missiles out of Cuba in exchange for the United States promising to never attack Cuba again. Well, isn't that nice? Because in the eyes of the world, it looked like Khrushchev blinked, and the Soviet Union had to take that because the Kennedy administration was just playing that up, running the gamut. They made the Soviet Union back down. But the rest of the story was there was an additional piece to that agreement, and it was called a private assurance. So President Kennedy sent a message, a direct communique, a back channel communique to Khrushchev saying, okay, secretly, and if it comes out, we'll deny everything. If you agree to the public agreement, we will privately and secretly remove the nuclear missiles that we put in Turkey in 1961. Oh yeah, yeah. We started this whole thing. We attacked Fidel Castro and tried to overthrow his government in the Bay of Pigs. Failing that, he asked you for protection. You gave him the protection after you saw that we put nuclear missiles in your backyard. So you figured, okay, if we are so bold-faced to attack our ally and fail, and then put nuclear missiles in our backyard, how could we publicly hold us to account for putting nuclear missiles in their backyard? Okay, well, no, but that's how we roll. Do as I say, not as I do. Right? Okay, here we go. So Khrushchev said, okay, I will take the public black eye in exchange for you moving your missiles out of Turkey. But here's the thing. No one knew about that agreement, and it was going to be 6 months later. So what if we didn't honor it? In Khrushchev's autobiography, yeah, I read it, because that's what you do with history. He admitted he trusted Kennedy. Here at the height of the Cold War, the thing that stopped us from World War III was the premiere of the Soviet Union in a context where they were not wrong. We started it. We put nuclear missiles on their border in Turkey before they put the nuclear missiles in Cuba. We attacked their ally in the Bay of Pigs. Right. Their ally was right for asking for protection. We are infinitely bigger than Cuba. Right? Okay. Right? So the Soviet Union wasn't wrong. But Khrushchev agreed to take the black eye because despite our shenanigans, Kennedy gave his word and he trusted that. See, this is the importance of your word meaning something. Yeah, hold on to that for the future. Okay. And so the the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. And we didn't learn out the rest of the story for decades. We know it now. And there's a great movie called 13 Days. Check it out. Kevin Costner. Check it out. Okay. All right. So that gets us through the Kennedy administration his great speech on peace in June 1963, and then ultimately his assassination tragically later that year. Okay. And that leads us into Vietnam. And this is the start, the perpetuating of the reason why we created the Cold War, which led to the Korean War, which led to the containment policy in Vietnam. Take note of one thing. The national security interests of the United States was not at stake. The national security, excuse me, let's back that up. The national security of the United States was not at stake in Vietnam, in Korea. Okay. Most of these places that the Cold War skirmishes, wars were fought. The risk of our country actually existing, war on our homeland, no, wasn't a factor. But here we go into Vietnam. And the slow build up over the 60s, and it's a quagmire because what are we fighting for? What is the mission for? Where this line is going to be, whether this country is allowed to choose communism or not, right? But we got to come up with a reason. So we come up with a reason. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm just saying, history has proved another lie. 100,000 people on our side. How many deaths? How many deaths on the Vietnamese side? North and South. For what? And here we are. Cambodia, Laos, all these places. Because the military industrial complex is now running things. And it leads us through the 60s into the 70s. The Nixon administration, Nixon runs, ironically, to get us out of the Vietnam War. Took him his first term and into the second term, but then Vietnam War wound down. Nothing accomplished. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides lost. Maybe 1 million. Ridiculous. For nothing. The only people who benefit is the for-profit companies who sold weapons to everybody, who sold the equipment to the government, to the military. Yeah, they did well. The people who fought it, the people who were with the collateral damage to it, lives destroyed. Lives destroyed. This is how you slowly wear the politics, the moral fiber of a nation, is when you ask people to kill or be killed. And it's not for meritorious reasons. Okay. So that gets us into the 70s. And here we're back to the Shah. Because since he took over, because he had different flunkies he would appoint to be prime minister, but essentially he was running the show. And he cut us a great deal, and the British got a great deal, and the Iranian people, well, barely got some. And for anyone who said boo, he put them down hard. Check the Shah of Iran's humanitarian record with any credible humanitarian agency for the 60s and 70s. You'll see. I mean, this guy was slaughtering his own people, and we were benefiting from it. So when he's dying of cancer, and the uprising is starting because he's losing the ability to control what's happening, and we protect him. We don't let the Gaddafi thing happen. It didn't happen yet, but we don't let the people get him. We protect him, and we give him safe passage. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. Gives him safe passage to the Philippines. Actually debated for a protracted period of time. Okay, but once the Iranian revolution occurred and they took over, first thing they did was attack the U.S. embassy and take our embassy workers as hostages. Okay, Now, I'm just going to tell you, as honest a president as I know is Jimmy Carter. We could debate how good a president he was, this and that, but he showed in his entire life, before, during the time he was in the presidency, and after, that he was a man of integrity. Wasn't perfect, made mistakes, all that's true. But here's the criticism of Jimmy, because he did not tell the American people why. Why would the Iranians attack the U.S. embassy? They were not a powerful country by any stretch. We were a superpower, and they hated us so badly that they attacked the U.S. embassy in Tehran. Okay, it would have been simple. Yeah, because we overthrew their government and and empowered a stooge who tortured them for over 20 years. And when it came time for him to get his comeuppance, we protected him and ushered him out of the country and gave him safe passage, had the audacity while they are negotiating with us over the hostages to be debating in America, should we repatriate? Should we bring the Shah to the United States? I mean, this is the level of hubris that we show to these people. So they attack our embassy and hold our hostage. And yeah, Jimmy tries to save them and tries to, whatever. No, not working. And, Reagan comes in and, fast movement. And then he endeavors to punish them for what they did, for embarrassing America. Yeah. How does Iran become our enemy? What would we have done? I'm just saying, if the situation was reversed. And I'm not saying life is fair. I'm just saying, when you're just that shitty, when you are making your enemies by the way you abuse them and their governments and their people, how you empower people to torture their people and then protect the torturers. And when they dare stand up and do anything, now we're going to support Iraq in the Iranian-Iraqi war in the 1980s under Reagan, and we're going to have Rumsfeld over there giving Iraq weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical weapons to use against the Iranians, killing tens of thousands of Iranians. And they're evil. They're evil. Okay. That brings us into the 1980s. And okay. So we got the Iranian hostage situation that gets resolved as President Reagan comes in. But in 1979 also, because we're busy, the government of Afghanistan was communist. Yeah, people were choosing it. Or the Soviets were helping them choose it, like we do, right? Okay. So the government of Afghanistan was communist. Oh, we couldn't have that. So we started training a group of Islamic militia called the Mujahideen. And it came from all over Asia and the Middle East. All the Muslim nations would send volunteers to create this militia. And we trained them because we wanted to destabilize that communist government in Afghanistan and see if we can convert it to a government that was friendly to us. That's our take. Right. In other words, a government we can control. Okay. So the war in Afghanistan starts in 1979. And we're successful. We're destabilized. It wasn't a strong government in Kabul. And the Soviet Union has to step in to help their little ally here. So they send the Red Army in. Then we really get excited because that's what we like. So, because Afghanistan is tough terrain, mountains, rigorous, just awful terrain. It's hard to fight. It's hard, whatever. But we got the Mujahideen doing the fight, so U.S. forces don't have to do it. The Red Army is in there themselves. Good. And we give them all the specialized training we can and all the specialized equipment designed to defeat the the weapons that the Soviet Red Army is using in Afghanistan. Oh, we even made a movie about this with Tom Hanks. Yeah, called Charlie Wilson's War. Check it out, right? And it's just a great story. And so the war goes on, and at first the Red Army is just slaughtering folks. They're just they're taking names. But slowly but surely through the training, the corner is turned by the mid 1980s, and by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union, the Red Army is getting worn out. They're getting worn out. Yeah. And so by 1989, a broken Red Army returns back to the Soviet Union. Spirit defeated, you know. So it was a successful mission. And 2 years later, the Soviet Union agreed to stand down and dissolve. That's successful. There's something that we need to recognize about that conflict and that war that we were fighting in a surrogate sense with the Soviet Union is that one of the groups that were fighting alongside the Mujahideen, and we say this carefully because, of course, history, I checked hard, and they've smudged the clues enough to where I have to say that there was a faction of Arab, of Saudi volunteer fighters who were fighting along with the Mujahideen. I mean, they were Islamic. The idea that they weren't Mujahideen, but the data has been scrubbed to the point where we cannot say that the leader of this Saudi Arab volunteer force that was financing also the Mujahideen and was getting trained with U.S. weapons and resources, and for sure used U.S. weapons and resources, but apparently they obtained them indirectly. Just say it, right? It's none other than Osama bin Laden. Right. Yeah. This is how he cut his teeth in combat, was fighting against the Red Army in Afghanistan in a holy war. Because again, that's what the Mujahideen, this wasn't a nationalist war. This was Muslims fighting an atheist communist government incursion in an otherwise Islamic country. And we are supposed to believe that this little carve out that had Osama bin Laden in it was not really the Mujahideen. They were just a volunteer force that was fighting along with them and got the benefit of using the equipment, got the benefit of understanding how to use the equipment, but weren't directly supplied or support. Oh, yeah, you make up your mind. But I'm just telling you, he was absolutely there. And, okay, so by 1989, they defeat the Red Army and go back to the UK. And so then in 1990, Saddam Hussein, who we have empowered in the war against Iran, which also happened simultaneously to this war in Afghanistan against the Red Army, and right. So we were supporting and training and supplying the Iraqis against the Iranians to punish them. And Iran is like 3 times the size of Iraq and should have crushed Iraq. But we were able to stiffen the back of the Iraqis, and they survived the war. So that war just ended. But after hundreds of thousands of deaths, a lot of them on the Iranian side. Okay. But then it ended. And emboldened by the fact that smaller Iraq did not get crushed by bigger Iran, Saddam Hussein said, you know what? Time to beat someone else. Time to beat someone up. So he looks around the corner and he sees Kuwait and he says, look at them. Over there all rich. And we got bills to pay. We've been at war over here. And yes, we borrowed some money from them. And it's about time. and we don't want to pay it back. So we're going over there to not only not pay it back, but take some of their money, take all their money, and take all their oil. So they attack, roll into Kuwait, take a Kuwait. Just it was gangster. It was you would have thought it was back in the neighborhood. I'm from the Bronx. Yeah, it's like what happened. Saddam Hussein looked at them and said, "What you got in your pocket?" And they resisted, and it was a smackdown, and that's all that happened. So now Iraq is taking Kuwait, and everyone's getting nervous because now Iraq is on the Arabian Peninsula with Saudi Arabia, and maybe this is an oil grab. Maybe because Kuwait has a lot of oil, Saudi has the most oil. Iraq has a lot of oil, but not as much as Iran and Saudi, and okay. So maybe this is an oil grab. And again, he just finished with a war with Iran. So this could be some, so everyone was worried. Well, everyone. The world was worried that Saddam Hussein might move forward. So here's where, again, the story gets interesting. So the United States was talking to the government of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family. And Osama bin Laden, who's a Saudi, and oh, by the way, the billionaire bin Laden's a massive construction magnate in Saudi Arabia. This is Saudi elite. He went to the Saudi royal family and he said, "Hey, by the way, let's get together the Mujahideen." Yeah, I know I'm not supposed to know them because according to the record books, I was in this little side group now. Yeah, let's gather the Mujahideen, who I know very well. I've been financing and okay. Yeah, and I got some pull, right? Let's get them. We just defeated the Red Army in Afghanistan. Let's gather them up and knock Saddam Hussein out of the Arabian Peninsula. That's what he asked. It's a matter of public record. Check it out. But George H.W. Bush said, "I see an opportunity." Because, business is booming. We got wars all over the place. Everyone is making money. And George H.W. Bush said, "We got an opportunity. Let us come in." The Japanese and a few others were agreeing to underwrite this cost. I will bring 500,000 troops. I will bring the M1s and M2s from Europe and bring them to Saudi Arabia. And we will repel Saddam back to Iraq. Let us do it. Japanese are going to help underwrite it. Let's do it. And faced with those two options, the Saudis looked at their own, looked at Osama bin Laden, and said, "They're offering a better deal. I'm going that way." Now, the catch to the American deal was we want permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. That it never happened before. The Saudi royal family said, "Yeah, we can make that work." And that's what happened. And so we brought NATO, essentially, you know, where I served in the 80s, in the late 80s. Where I served. Yeah, we bought all those armors. I was there for the M1, M2s. Yeah. We had the old M60A3s before. Then we got the M1s. Yeah. They brought all of that to Saudi. And they repelled Saddam Hussein off the Arabian Peninsula and back to Iraq. And then they set up shop, permanent bases. But the thing is, Osama was pissed off now. And why? Why? Well, he told us why. He did a fatwa in 1996. And I got to read what the fatwa said. The literal title of the fatwa was Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. See, because in Saudi Arabia is Mecca and Medina. These are the two holy of the holies for the Islamic faith. Every Muslim is required to make a pilgrimage to the Holy of the Holies, principally Mecca. Malcolm X did. and it changed him. Check out his autobiography. Right. So this is the holy of the holies, the most sacred. And what having non-believers protecting and occupying the land of the holy of the holies. This, in the eyes of Osama bin Laden and many Muslims and their faith, and there's disputes over this, but in his view, as a wasabi or what have you, this was the ultimate blasphemy. And so, whether you agree with it or not, it's not my place. I'm not a Muslim, right? He declared a holy war on the United States and the Saudi royal family. And he's a Saudi for blaspheming by inviting non believers into the holy of the holies who are not practicing the faith. These are soldiers. They are drinking like fish. And dads, hide your daughters. You know how it is. If I didn't serve, I wouldn't be able to say it, but I hide your daughters in Saudi Arabia. So you cannot blame, well, you can. I'm not justifying 3,000 American deaths. What I'm trying to say is you understand. We need to understand. How does our enemies? What motivates our enemies? Here it is. In 1996, he wrote what the problem was. Yeah. And the thing about it, the worst thing about this is the U.S. government knew what was motivating Osama bin Laden. They knew he fought in Afghanistan using our weapons, using our training against the Red Army. They knew that he had offered to bring the Mujahideen and have the Muslims repel Saddam Hussein. And that wasn't a crazy idea. Again, we could have trained them just like we did in Afghanistan. We could have given them the weapons to do the fighting like they did in Afghanistan. So it wasn't a bad idea. It made sense. If it would have worked against the Red Army, it damn sure would have worked against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis. So the rationale wasn't wrong. Okay. And so this is okay. And at the very least, the American people needed to know, because what did he do? He started tearing up stuff. The World Trade Center bombing in 1993. He blew up buildings in Saudi Arabia in 1995. He bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. He bombed the USS Cole in 2000, killing 17 sailors. He was doing all this stuff, and he said, why? Declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of 2 holy places. There was a reason, and it had nothing to do with they are jealous or they hate us for our freedoms. He's a billionaire, by the way. Okay. It's just saying. None of this is to justify what he did, but it is supposed to illuminate the fact that we did not know. And in fact, I'm pretty sure before this podcast, you did not know that what the British were so generous of at admitting in a documentary called Why We Fight that they released in 2005, which plainly said that 9/11 was blowback for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Yeah, we knew the reason, we knew the why. We refused to tell the American public, and we refused to yield. So if you want to know, if this is the first time you're hearing it, yes, your government, my government, the people I voted for and you voted for, right, allowed 3,000 Americans to die for a reason they knew, and to this day have not fully disclosed. It doesn't justify what Al-Qaeda did. It explains why they did it. And it wasn't the nonsense they told us. And oh, by the way, the Saudis were the enemy too. I mean, like I said, the Saudis chose to ally with us, chose to allow us to have the military bases in Saudi Arabia. But the American public, since Clinton knew that this was the reason, the fatwa was issued in 1996. Since George W. Bush knew that this is why he is hating Americans and trying to kill Americans, right? It was incumbent on them to tell us: is it this terrorist organization is coming after us because we have permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia? Should we remove those bases? We're going to do everything we can to protect you, but they're trying to kill Americans because we have these military bases. Yes, they had a responsibility to come to us. Yes, that would have been a tough message. Yes, we would have very likely said, um, do we really need the bases there? Because where we travel everywhere, you can't protect us everywhere. Yeah, and I don't want to get blown up. So yeah, I think Americans might have said, you might want to reconsider. Right, but we didn't get the chance. And when we did get sacrificed, they just lied. They never disclosed. We had the 9/11 Commission, a bunch of blah 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 blah. How about the clarity of, well, just take out the fatwa, okay? Oh, it gets worse, by the way. And this is, again, it goes back to what Eisenhower was saying about when you don't constrain the military industrial complex, how it poisons your politics, poisons your economics, poisons the moral fiber of your country. And this is an example of how, in the interest to have enemies that drive the sale of military weapons, that drive military actions that require more weapons to be purchased around the world, to do this all over the place, creating as many enemies because it's good for business, right? Ultimately comes down to Americans getting sacrificed too, because all that military activity is killing people all over the world. Did you know that Osama bin Laden wrote a letter to America in 2002? Yeah, explaining why he attacked Americans on 9/11. Look, to this day, we study Mein Kampf. We study in graduate school who Adolf Hitler is, what made him tick. How could that happen? We study Das Kapital. We study Stalin, Lenin, Marx. We study Genghis Khan. Knowledge. We must learn. We must throw nothing away because it all helps us to understand and maybe not repeat history. So it's not a glorification of Osama bin Laden to understand what motivates him to do what he does, right? To understand who he is. Right? That helps us to understand, why is this happening to us? Okay? Well, he wrote us a letter, and our American media and our American government suppressed it. That's why none of us knew about it. I didn't know about it. And it sat in the digital archives of the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom from 2002 all the way to November 2023. And the reason why is, if you go to the Guardian newspaper in their archives and you look for where it was, you're going to see an error message that it's been removed. And the reason why it's been removed is how Israel decided to respond to October 7th, 2023, when Hamas engaged in a terrorist attack and killed over 1,100 Israelis and took 252 hostages. Okay. Israel responded. One of the ways they responded is they said, there are no innocent Palestinians in Gaza. Why? Because Hamas is the elected leadership of the Palestinians. This is their government. They selected them in a democratic vote. Of course, they failed to mention that that democratic vote occurred in 2005, right? And that there's so many children there's so many children in Gaza that the average age is approaching 18. So therefore, the actual Palestinians who voted for Hamas, and it was a plurality. It was like 30 something percent. In 2005, in terms of how many of those people are still alive, on October 7th, 2023, right, is a sliver of the 2.3 million people who lived in Gaza at the time of that terrorist attack. But that's logic. Let's throw that out. The fact is that this became the justification that Netanyahu and his government said for why they were going to cut off all the people and that there were no innocent ones. So we're cutting off all the food, all the water, all the energy. We're going to starve these people. We're going to bomb everyone. Everyone is subject to getting killed. Yeah, that's why we have genocide. That's why the International Court of Justice is about to convict them. Okay. Yeah. But the rationale, he said, was because the people voted for that government, and that government chose to do this, attack us in this way. Well, for whatever reason, our youngins, Gen Z, on TikTok, somehow found bin Laden's letter to America from 2002 on the Guardian website. And it went viral in the end of October of 2023. And you talk about the vitriol. You had posts on TikTok that said everything that I was told about 9/11 has proven to be a lie. I will never trust them again. There was 1 million people who saw those kind of posts individually. I mean, 1 million. I mean, it went viral. It became so hot on TikTok, right, that the U.S. government intervened with China or whatever they had to do. They forced the Guardian newspaper to pull the Bin Laden, a letter to America so that no one could see it. Right? I have a copy. Yeah, I have a copy. Right? Okay. Right? And TikTok banned all those people who made those posts. All those posts, you can't find them anymore. I just happened to experience it in real time. Yeah. That's becoming more and more normal these days. Yeah. Okay. But the reason why they said it is because what bin Laden had said in his letter to America is the reason why he attacked us is because we elect the American governments. We elected Eisenhower in 1952 when they overthrew Mossadegh, the CIA, U.S. CIA overthrew Mossadegh, democratically elected prime minister of Iran, who was only defending Iranian assets. Right? We overthrew him and install and let the Shah run the show. And he tortured and killed thousands of Iranians over his reign and benefited us, gave us cut rate deals on the oil. Right? Okay, this is what bin Laden is saying. We elect these people, and then they do what? We elected Jimmy Carter. And when the Iranians stood up and took the U.S. hostages, did not admit that the reason why they're angry at us is because we put in a government that tortured their people for 20 years after overthrowing their government. No, didn't admit that. Allowed Reagan to just go ahead and vilify them again by selling biological and chemical weapons to the Iraqis to use against the Iranians in the war in the 1980s. I mean, these are the kind of things. This is what bin Laden is saying. We elect these governments, and this is what they're doing to Muslims around the world. And so our only recourse is to attack the people, the American people who are electing these governments. Because you know what? In a democracy that's supposed to be government of the people, for the people, by the people, right? Yeah. It's tragic that someone else would hold us accountable, us responsible for the government we elect. But that's the argument he was making. In my opinion, we didn't know. We were ignorant. This is true. We were still responsible, and that I don't think if we knew that these things were going on, that we would endorse these things. But the fact is that these people were empowered because we put them in power. So his argument was that if you put them in power, you're responsible for what they do. Well, if what Netanyahu is saying is true, that because the Palestinians in Gaza elected Hamas in 2005, right, right, that then the people of the Palestinians are all responsible for what their government does. If that is a dreadful argument, but we are saying it's true, we're supporting him. We're supporting him doing that. Then bin Laden's argument then must be true. Do you believe it's true? Because I don't believe that all the Gazans, all the Palestinians are guilty because some segment of their population elected Hamas. What? I mean, it was 2005, 18 years earlier? That's ridiculous. No more do I think that for those who voted for Joe Biden, that you had any idea that he would rationalize a genocide. But we empowered him, right? And so I don't think it's a good argument, but it's either true and therefore bin Laden is right, or it's not true. And what are we doing endorsing what Netanyahu and his government is doing? I mean, this is what the kids were saying. When it comes to genocide, you're talking about hypocrisy at the worst rank. Okay. So this is what Eisenhower is speaking to about how running your economics, running your politics through the military industrial complex, how it poisons the moral fiber of a country. It poisons your politics. It poisons your economics, because these are the rationales that drive policy. People are dying left, right, and center. You're creating enemies, not because they need to be enemies, but because you need enemies because they're good for business. And we just kept it going. So we came through 9/11, right? Okay. We used that excuse for what happened for George W. Bush to create to legalize the forever wars. The notion of a forever war is an enemy that never ends. The war on terror. It's not the reason why the Geneva Conventions contemplated sovereigns. War is a battle between sovereigns. It's because sovereigns have designated territory. They have governments that fall. They have governments that can surrender. They have a certain number of people. They have a certain amount of resource. All these are limiting factors that limit what a war can be fought over, right? But when you fight against a concept, all of a sudden we go from Al Qaeda to ISIS to this one to that one to that one to that one. You're fighting forever, fighting forever. And so that's what we have in Afghanistan. You know, I mean, we got into Afghanistan because the Taliban housed Al Qaeda, allowed Al Qaeda to train in their territory, right? And so we go there to hold them accountable. They're sovereign of a sort for what Al Qaeda did in attacking us on 9/11. That's where it starts. But then we really show our hand because we go in, they topple quickly, put in a new government, democracy, things kind of quiet down a little bit while the Taliban is organizing their counterinsurgency and coming back and stuff, right? But we like that. We let that happen because we want that fight. We want that fight. And we slowly get it back as they come up and they're doing their counterinsurgency and we're fighting. And oh, by the way, by 2011, we find bin Laden and we kill him. So, okay, now it's calmed down, right? I mean, we've been at this for 10 years. Haven't we made enough money yet? No. Bin Laden is dead. Al Qaeda is gone. Structured all, all the top 10, top 50, whatever, most of them gone, right? No, business is booming. It's 2011. Obama is not letting that go. So, so we continue on in Afghanistan. You're right. For another 10 years, 20 years of Afghanistan. The Taliban was running Afghanistan when we got there. The Taliban is running Afghanistan after we left. We trained 600,000 Afghans, armed them to the teeth with the best military weapons we could just sell them, or at least the most expensive, because, of course, we're paying for it. Right. And within a week of us leaving, with our tail in between our legs, haven't achieved nothing, right? They turn over all the weapons to the Taliban. But it don't matter because everyone who was getting paid got paid, right? The military industrial complex. I mean, this is 20 years of Afghanistan. It cannot, the level of failure that represents doesn't happen by accident. It happens because it's revealing the true motive. It's not about achieving a mission and getting in and getting out. It's, it's about the conflict and keeping the conflict going because we don't care about the soldiers' lives that we're destroying. We don't care about the civilian lives that we're destroying. We don't care about the countries that we're destabilizing and the pain and suffering that we're creating and the bad will and the bad karma and all that stuff because we're selling weapons to everybody and making crazy money for the people who own the military industrial complex. Front and center, BlackRock, right? They own most of them. Just saying, right? Okay. But that's not enough. 20 years of, so Obama, mission accomplished, bin Laden is dead. Obama got to take the bow that W never could take, even though he said mission accomplished 10 years or 8 years earlier. And Obama just rolls right into, we got to have something else going. So what's happening over here in Ukraine? Because George W. Bush announced at the NATO summit in 2008 the intent for NATO to expand across Europe to include Ukraine. And Putin, who ran Russia then, like he does now, communicated both publicly and privately to the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who communicated privately to George W. Bush before the NATO summit, that any idea of expanding NATO all the way to include Ukraine, that this was their absolute red line, that the entire political class in Russia considers it an existential threat to the national security of Russia. Yeah, that was clearly communicated. Putin said it publicly. Right? This would be a direct threat to our national security. And they said it privately. This is our red line. So what does Obama do? Now that, he's running out of it, how long can he squeeze this turnip in Afghanistan? We got to get something else going. His deputy secretary of state in charge of Eastern Europe, in charge of Ukraine, in terms of that's our area that she covers. Diplomacy, supposedly, right? The Russians catch her on tape. Go to YouTube and look for Victoria Nuland and Ukraine. See what you find. Catches her on tape. The beginning of February 1940, 2014, 1940, World War II. So in the beginning of February, like February 2nd, 2014, still in the second term of Barack Obama, Victoria Nuland is talking to the United States ambassador to Ukraine. And she's telling the ambassador, okay, these are the people who we're going to install to be the new government of Ukraine. Now, while she's saying this, there is a democratically elected NATO neutral prime minister or whatever the leader is called in Ukraine. He's democratically elected. No one is saying that it wasn't a fair election. And oh, by the way, in 2015, there's a new election scheduled. Okay. But these people, there's a reason why they're not waiting for these elections because there's no sovereign expression of the Ukrainian people that has endorsed being anti Russian. A lot of them are ethnically Russian. Okay. So they can't win an election. So what do? Victoria Nuland is talking about we are going to install this new government. And oh, like clockwork, by the end of February, you have the cholera revolution, violent overthrow, and the democratically elected leader of Ukraine runs off to Russia. Right. Right. And in comes the people that Victoria Nuland said would be put in. And the first thing that government does is they call Jeffrey Sachs. Who? Jeffrey Sachs. I think he's the most important developmental economist, certainly in my lifetime, and I'll be 60 November 30th. Right? Okay. Because he is the developmental economist that the United States sent to help the former Warsaw Pact nations, principally Poland and Romania and even Russia, convert from the old communist central control economics to a free market economy. He's the guy. He worked with Yeltsin. He worked with the leadership across Russia. He worked Lech Wałęsa, all these people in Poland and all that stuff. And so his reputation is above reproach when it comes to these governments needing to transition their economies. And the Ukrainian economy was complementary to the Russian economy. So there were things, parts of the widgets produced in Ukraine, parts of the widgets produced in Russia, and then, exchange and stuff like that. And now you have complete. It was very intertwined. It was working, by the way. Ukraine is like the breadbasket, to much of Africa and Middle East. But okay, fine. Forget about that with these people, right? So they called Jeffrey Sachs and said, come in. We need you to unwind our economics from Russia because now we're going to be European Union, NATO. We're going for it. Jeffrey Sachs comes. He doesn't know about any shenanigans. But when he gets on the ground there, the NGOs, U.S. representatives on the ground, and the newly installed Ukrainians kind of proud of what they did. Yes, he was told that the United States paid, thank you, Barack, the United States paid for the violent overthrow of that democratically elected government. Yes, we paid for it. See, because this is the ethics of when the military-industrial complex is running things. Got to have an enemy. And what better way to punish and piss off Russia? Because we are moving NATO to their border, and they're going to like it. Here we go, right? And Jeffrey Sachs, a man of principle, a principal contributor to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, read them to see how important they are. That's Jeffrey Sachs. He said, I'm not going to be participating in this. I'm not, no. He left. He refused to help the Ukrainians unwind their economics when they got put into power under those circumstances. And what did those Ukrainians do? They turned around and they banned Russian language, Russian Orthodox religion, Russian expression. And when ethnically Russian Ukrainians resisted, they started slaughtering them. Yeah, the people we put in. Just saying. Yeah, yes, we can. Yeah, yes, we can. Yeah, right up there with Henry Kissinger. Yes, we can. My Lai massacre. Here we go again. Right. Yes, we can. Right. Okay. So that's what happened. And what the Russians did at that point is they attacked. We talk about them taking Crimea. They were already leasing the bases, had long-term leases with the previous government. It was us who came in and got that government overthrown, put in a government who started slaughtering ethnically Russian Ukrainians. So yes, they came in, secured Crimea, and protected ethnically Russian Ukrainians who were being slaughtered because they were trying to practice their Russian culture in Ukraine because this is where they're from, but they're historically Russian, they're ethnically Russian, right? Okay. So they came and they protected their people. And then they signed a peace treaty with Ukraine, 2015, the Minsk II agreement. And that agreement was endorsed by Germany, France, and Poland. Sponsored by Germany, France, and Poland, and endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, the United States, China, yeah, Russia. Oh, yes, yes. And that agreement said it protected the geographic integrity of Ukraine, but it protected ethnically Russian Ukrainians in that they were allowed to practice their faith, use their language, honor their culture. They were able to legally protect it against being banned by the government in Kyiv. That was what the Minsk II agreements do. I will send you a link. I will put a link in the notes here. And then we told the Ukrainians who agreed to that, you don't got to force that. And the Germans, we really just wanted, literally, the chancellor told Putin, at our public record, yeah, we really didn't really mean that. We just kind of, delaying. It's like a delay tactic while we continue to train the Ukrainians and arm the Ukrainians. And Americans are building secret bases there that you know about, yes. And that's what happened 2015, 2016, leading up to what was on the front page of the New York Times, which is that we were building secret bases in Ukraine. So then by December of 2021, the Russians put the Red Army on the Ukrainian border. But they didn't come across yet. They sent a direct communique to the NATO Secretary General and said, hey, notwithstanding the fact that we told you back in 2008, that your own U.S. ambassador told you back in 2008, what this means to Russia, you trying to put Ukraine in NATO and forward position nuclear weapons on our border, right? We would like a summit right here, right now. We won't come across the border. We want a summit on the security question of Ukraine joining NATO. And our man Joe, the old man, he had NATO respond back to Putin. And I want you to think about, the Bay of Pig. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Because just hold that on the side. What NATO responded, and the Secretary General has had the audacity to say this publicly, what they said privately. They told Putin, NATO expansion is not the business of Russia, even to your border. So he said, okay. And on February 2022, he attacked Ukraine. Okay. And the rest is history. Europe has invested about $150 billion. We have invested about $125 to $150 billion, $300 billion. And Ukraine is going to lose. Date certain. Not date certain, but it's imminent. The battle lines are collapsing as we speak. The draft age is up to 60 in Ukraine. Ukraine is considerably smaller, has considerably less military. We've given them, we've, we've basically emptied NATO's arsenal to help them defend themselves, and they are going to lose for sure. But once again, even with almost 1 million Ukrainians dead, yeah, BlackRock did good. Gangbusters, like I said, up to $150 billion. The casino always wins, and that's the ethics of the military industrial complex running things, running your economics, running your politics, is that you tell the American people we're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for the sovereignty of Ukraine when the Ukrainians have never voted to be anti-Russian. When the Ukrainian independence when the Soviet Union dissolved was conditional on them not joining NATO. When we promised Secretary of State James Baker, HW Secretary of State, promised the former Soviet Union as a condition of their dissolution, as a condition of them supporting the reunification of Germany, who was allowed to join NATO to preserve the security buffer, because the European powers were always the aggressor in the conflicts between Europe and Russia. And we gave them the private assurance, the same private assurance that President Kennedy gave Khrushchev to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. We gave them the private assurance that we would not expand NATO 1 inch east of Germany. Since that private assurance, NATO has expanded to include every country in the former Warsaw Pact, and 3 of the former Soviet provinces are in NATO. And we, our man Joe, characterized Russia attacking Ukraine in February of 2022 as an unprovoked attack, a naked aggression on the part of Putin against the sovereign people of Ukraine. I mean, you can't get more diametrically opposed to the truth than that. This is why we live in President Eisenhower's nightmare. Because it is this ethics. Historians say that we lost our innocence in Vietnam. Innocence that we demonstrated in World War II, where we all sacrificed for the war effort, where war profiteering was treason, where we had our coupons, not me personally, but, parents or whatever, coupons to conserve, to make sure that the rubber and all this other stuff got to this. Yes. When the nation went to war, we went to war, all of us. Even if we didn't fight, we supported it. Yes. That was our innocence. And we lost it because in Vietnam, because America realized that our leadership was willing to send our children to die and to kill for reasons that were not protecting the national security of America, but to make someone some money. Yeah. So this is where we are. In 1992, federal debt was $4 trillion. Right now, federal debt is over $38 trillion. So $34 trillion in excess federal debt. That means the federal government spent $34 trillion in the last 33 years, right? Spent more than it brought in to the private sector. When you look at who benefited from that $34 trillion, and you look at the fact that the middle class in this country, for the first time in 2021, according to the Federal Reserve, that the top 1% have more wealth and income than the American middle class for the first time in history, that the American working class, 12% food insecure. I mean, the impact, who benefited from that 34 trillion? It went exclusively to the top 1% and beyond. That we created the wealthiest billionaire class in history by far. That the American infrastructure is falling apart. Remember the bridge in Baltimore? Yeah, check the report, the national reports on American infrastructure. D's. Yeah. The state of American education, the state of American health. Yeah. Who benefited from all these conflicts, all these wars? Extreme wealth at the expense of everybody else. You want to know why we have no money for anything else? When we are willing to give Zelensky billions of dollars? Yeah, it's because the military industrial complex is running everything and has bankrupted our federal government and has broken and has participated in breaking the back of our men and women in military. As a veteran, all these wars, all this conflict, all this death and suffering, all this post-traumatic stress, and none of it for the national security of the country, all of it to create extreme wealth and make them even wealthier. Yeah. So this is your breadcrumb. Your breadcrumb. Why we fight? Tragically, because it's good for somebody's business. And it's about time that we recognize it for what it is. And that we go back and listen to President Eisenhower's 16-minute speech, where he asked us, implored us to not mortgage our grandchildren's futures for the comfort and the ease, I don't know whose comfort and ease at this point, of us today. Well, it's the comfort and ease of the extremely wealthy that has mortgaged our grandchildren's future to the tune of $34 trillion in 33 years. We can do better now that we know. So check the references in this episode's notes. Take note, and I want to take a moment to note this, the kind of banana republic we've become, how blatant censorship is. There's an incredible documentary called The Untold History of the United States. Try to find it. I had to go. You can go on Amazon and get some copies of it. The thing is, it was on for a season. I believe it was on Showtime for a season, right? There's videos and there is a book. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on eBay. But everyone associated with that film, including the very famous director, you try to get the film. I mean, it's amazing how things get scrubbed. But once again, this is an accounting of so much of the stuff that happened in World War II, that happened in that convention, which you can verify, and you can. I was able to easily verify using other sources, but this was a nice, concise, lucid retelling. And by say retelling, is that the prevailing narratives about our history like our understanding of how the Cold War started and why it started, right? Right. This thing destroys all that by showing you verified facts that explain what this was all about. Okay. And I hope that I've been successful in this episode in doing that. So thank you. Yes, this may have been my longest of the of the episodes, but it's important. Why we fight. I hope you enjoyed it. You take care, and I'll see you next time in the conversation.